Hey adventurers, so today is going to be another book review. This is going to be for The Way of Edan by Philip Chase. This is high fantasy, epic fantasy, a little bit of like a classic fantasy in some ways, and in some of the ways that it's written and inspired by a little bit of religious fantasy as well. Just a lot of subgenres, mythical, I forget the terms that he has that Philip Chase has used to describe this series. But let's get into this. So The Way of Edan is the debut novel of Philip Chase and the first book in the Edan Trilogy. This book is very much high and epic fantasy in the vein of many of the classics. I can't help but mention things like Tolkien, like Lord of the Rings, and many others as well, but that has, I know for a fact, was a inspiration to him in many ways, though certainly set apart in its own way from those classics. Chase's influences are very obvious in this book, but that's not in a bad way at all. It's very clear that he knows exactly what he wants from this novel, and part of that is that love letter aspect to the fantasy genre and to the fantasy greats and classic greats and medieval literature that Chase knows so well and loves himself. I do occasionally watch Chase's YouTube content, so I'm just mentioning that. I do occasionally watch his YouTube content and I appreciate his insights and thoughts, but I really don't feel like that has influenced my decision making at all, my opinions at all on this book, on this novel in any way, shape, or form, really. I don't feel like it has. I did end up prioritizing this book because another YouTuber and author, J.R. Carroll, was reading it at the same time and wanted to discuss it a little bit with me, and so he basically asked me if I'd read it, and based on something that I had said about a previous book, he was kind of trying to get my thoughts on it a little bit, and so I said I haven't read it yet, I will prioritize it. And just when he was talking about that, the audiobook had just then come out recently, and so I was like, the audiobook's out, I should prioritize this. So I did, and so I decided to read this one as well, and so I could discuss it with him and give my thoughts on his questions. Before I get on into the rest of this review, I'd just quickly like to say welcome to an Erudite adventure. I'm T. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you are liking what you're seeing from us. So, as I already mentioned, this is very much an epic fantasy series, and it fits very nicely into that subgenre, into that epic fantasy subgenre. It very much, like, no question about it, is epic fantasy. And it is very much akin to classic fantasy stories. I mentioned Tolkien. I know there's some other ones that I think I could reference even though I haven't read them. Things like Shannara, things like, what's it called? Tad Williams, what's the series called that he, with Dragonbone Chair, whatever that series is. I feel like that's there's a bit of a reference, or not reference, but in a bit of that same style as those stories that are just these epic, hugely important monuments of classic fantasy that people, when you say classic fantasy, those are the stories that people are thinking of. I'm not trying, and I don't know if Chase was taking inspiration from those at all. I'm just saying that those are the types of stories that I am reminded of even when I haven't read them, but those are the types of stories that I am reminded of while I was reading the Way of Edan. But it has Chase's own take on fantasy races such as elves and dwarves, but it's done in a way that fits the world that he is building. The time and effort put into this book does not go unnoticed. It's very clear that Chase has been working on this for years and been thinking about this series and this world for many years. Chase has meticulously planned each detail in order to fill out the world in a believable way. In many ways, this book feels like a modern take on classical fantasy from someone who is intimately familiar with the genre. Jay from the Contemplative Reader described this book as a classic fantasy which is told in modern language. And I feel like that is a very apt description. If you want to, I actually really appreciated Jay's video. He didn't call it a review, he called it a spiritual discussion, I believe, on this book, and I'll have it linked up in the cards as well. Very good video. I thought that his analysis of this book was spot on. Yeah, I thought it was a very good video as well. One of the major aspects of this series is the religious war that is taking place in the world. We have several different religions and sects vying for power and dominance. Chase again here clearly took inspiration from real world religions, which I think is really the best way to approach a religious war of any sort, with the way being modeled after Catholicism. But then the other cultures and religions are influenced from many of the other non-Christian religions as well, and from our own world. It at times almost feels like there's a bit of a critique or bashing of Christianity, but as I continued through the book and I met more characters and more personalities within the world and within the Way, it felt more like a critique of organized religion and religious oppression rather than a straight up bashing of Catholicism. And even with that, there is a historical accuracy which Chase is clearly drawing upon for inspiration. As I was listening to this book and even now looking back at it, I can't help but compare it a bit to Sanderson's Elantris and the Derethi religion that contained therein. I feel like there's some very, I don't know, in my mind I was making some correlations between those books and those series and Hrathen, the main priest that we're seeing in that series, and just his view of the world, his view of religion, stuff like that. And I was seeing some of those similar themes come up in Chase's work here. I don't see that as a bad thing at all. It's just an interesting correlation that my mind went to. I did listen to the audiobook for this one, and I actually have some thoughts on that as well. I do think it was well narrated. I'll get that out of the way to start with. Alan Walker from the Library of Alexandria did the narration, and it was very good. He's a very good narrator. He's a very good character. He's very good at doing the characters. But with all that, I actually found it a bit distracting to me. It was a little bit distracting. As far as the character voices go, I feel like Walker does a phenomenal job and just like absolutely disappears into the characters. But the narration itself was a little bit harder for me. For one, it made me just think, oh, I'm listening to his YouTube channel a little bit. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's fine. And most readers won't have a problem with that. For me, it just messed with my perception just a little bit. But the narration itself was a bit harder for me. Not bad, but I feel like there was an energy and like hyperness to the narration that was a little too strong and too strong for the story in the world. It didn't quite fit the tone that I was expecting while reading this book and while hearing about this book. And so for me, the narration portion of Walker's narration was a little overmuch, and for me personally as a reader. Again, it wasn't bad, and I had a bit of a hard time getting as lost in the world as I wanted to. That is absolutely my opinion. That's my own reader brain trying to process the audiobook. I do listen to a lot of audiobooks, but it was absolutely just that is 100% my opinion, and I know a lot of people have really enjoyed the narration. And overall, I do think it is a good narration. I do think Walker does a really actually phenomenal job with the story and with the characters especially. And I will definitely keep listening to these books as they continue to come out, mostly because I'm far more likely to get to the audiobooks than I am the physical books anytime soon. Overall, I thought this was a solid book with a lot of great aspects to it. I found it a bit more slow or boring at times than I was hoping, but I also acknowledge that this is the first book in a trilogy, and I still enjoyed it quite a bit, even with those moments, those times where I felt it was a little bit boring. Or I don't like saying it was boring, because it wasn't like I was bored listening to it. It was more of I was not as actively engaged as I would have liked to be. But even with that, I still enjoyed it quite a bit. It is I don't think I could say it's a favorite book of all time for me, but there's definitely a lot of potential here, and I can see Chase only getting better and better with each successive book. And in fact, that's what I've heard about the Edan Trilogy, is that each book is better than the previous, or at least books 2 and 3 are both better than book 1 was. So I am excited to keep reading, and I think there's a lot of great stuff in this book. It just, book 1 didn't end up being my favorite of all time. But yeah, there's a lot to love, a lot of the mythological, the historical, the religious, the medieval aspects, all of these influences that Chase has pulled from, and his knowledge and his understanding of those topics really makes for something quite unique and quite interesting in this book. And I did enjoy it greatly, but it is not a favorite book of all time for me. I'm trying to balance it out, because I really enjoyed a lot of aspects about it, but it's not a favorite book I've ever read. So anyways, that is my review for The Way of Edan by Philip Chase. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday, and have our social medias linked in the description down below. We will see you guys again soon. Stay warm.